Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This book was really popular on Goodreads and YouTube I think as well last year, and it's received raving reviews. I think on Goodreads it has like a 4.2 rating at least, so yeah, lots of people really seem to love it. I finally read it. I got it for my birthday back in November I think, and I finally read it, and overall I liked it, but I have very mixed feelings about this book, which I will get into in a bit. I'll just first put it down because my edition is absolutely massive. It's 800 pages, but it seems even longer because of the size of this book. Yeah, the book is a fantasy book set in a different world than our own, and I think mainly what you need to know about it is that it is set in a world where almost 1,000 years ago there was a dragon who destroyed many parts of the world and killed lots of people, and eventually he was trapped. And some people in this world believe that the dragon will remain trapped for as long as a person from the royal family of the Breathness will remain on the throne of the country of Innis. I don't know, fantasy names, never know how to pronounce them, but that's what I'm going for. I think that's kind of all you should know going into this book, because while it definitely has some original elements, I do feel like the overall story is quite straightforward. The book is told through 4 different points of view, 2 in the west, 2 in the east, and I think my main issue with this book was that I just didn't really like 2 of these points of view, and that those were the points of view from Tanae and Nicholas, who are both in the west of this world, and I didn't really like their point of view, and for different reasons. For Tanae, I don't know, I just didn't really feel, I think for both I didn't really feel like their storylines really were necessary for the overall story. Tanae's storyline actually seemed to set up a kind of story that was never really picked up again. Like at some point it just kind of seemed to fade out, and I felt like I was reading 2 different books when I was reading about the West and when I was reading about Tanae, so that felt a little bit weird. And I also didn't really like her personality, same with the other character in the East, Nicholas. They were both really selfish, and I don't know, maybe if they had some other qualities besides that maybe would have made it easier to relate, but especially with Tanae, she was just ambitious and selfish. Those are not really qualities that I can relate to very easily or make someone likable. I don't know, I think I can more often understand it when people in books do something bad if they care for people, but when people pretty much just care about themselves, I find it really hard to root for them. So yeah, I wasn't really very interested in those storylines, to be honest, and I just feel like the story would have been stronger without them. I do think a lot of people might disagree, because Tanae's point of view is the point of view where you see most dragons, I think, and lots of people always seem to love dragons. I don't know what it is, like I think dragons are cool in books, but I'm not someone that specifically would read a book because it contains dragons. Like I like fantasy books, but dragons are kind of on the same level as any type of fantasy creature for me, so I feel like a lot of people might disagree with me there, but I just feel like the book would have been much stronger if Tanae's storyline had been left out. The book is 800 pages and overall it just feels very, very slow. That was my personal feeling. It just gets, like, it took me about 200 pages I think to really feel like I felt immersed in the story, and then the last 150 or so pages I was again not super interested in the story. I just wanted it to wrap up, because as I mentioned before, the overall story I think is just very straightforward fantasy, good versus evil kind of story, and yeah, because of that, the ending was kind of predictable, and I was just waiting for it to happen because I already kind of knew what was going to happen. But then in the middle part, I did really like the story, because that's, I think, where, you know, we get to see more of the characters, and also where some of the more interesting concepts are introduced. Because what I did like about this book was one of the types of magic. There's sort of like two types of magic that are mentioned in this book. Yeah, they're kind of related. It's kind of hard to describe. And I think, again, I have mixed feelings about the magic system, because it sort of felt like there were two types of magics, like two magic systems in this book, and like they are related sort of, but it felt a bit weird. I feel like the book again would have been stronger if the author had just chosen one of the two, and one of those is related to the Priory of the Orange Tree, which is the title of the book, and that type of magic I thought was really interesting, and I would have loved to know much more about it. I feel like, yeah, I just wanted to know more about that. The other magic system, I didn't really understand it that well. I thought it was kind of vague, and it's also new to the characters at some point, like the characters haven't really heard of it, and I just didn't really, I thought it was kind of strange that most of the characters just instantly accepted it, even though the explanations are kind of vague, and as a reader I didn't really understand it, so I thought it was kind of vague that characters would so easily just accept this new form of magic. But yes, the type of magic that is related to the Priory of the Orange Tree I thought was really interesting, and also the organisation related to the Priory of the Orange Tree, I thought that was really interesting, and that's also more prominent in the middle part of the book, and that's why I enjoyed it a lot more. I think I always kind of enjoy like sort of secret societies sort of stories. I think that's always really interesting, so I enjoyed learning more about this priory. What I also thought was interesting was some of the titles that were used for people, because very often people would be introduced by the title first and then pronouns would follow later on, and I've seen other people mention this as well, but I definitely realised that at certain times I would kind of, apparently I imagined someone to be a guy, because just by their title, and then later on when a pronoun was used I realised, oh, they were actually a woman. I hadn't realised that was mostly the case for like spiritual figures. I hadn't realised, but yeah, I do think for when it comes to spiritual figures, I usually kind of assume someone is male, but it isn't always the case, and I kind of liked that this book sort of pointed that out to me, that I was kind of had the prejudice myself. I have also seen this book being called like a feminist, I don't know if it's here, feminist Lord of the Rings. Yeah, here someone mentions that it is a feminist successor to the Lord of the Rings. I definitely think the comparison to Lord of the Rings is a bit much, but I also don't necessarily think this is a super feminist book. As I mentioned, the titles did make me think about like my own ideas of which people would have which roles, but other than that I didn't feel like this was a particularly feminist book. Like, it's also not like misogynistic, but also didn't feel like it really had like a very feminist message, because yes, there is a queendom instead of a kingdom, but these queens are really pushed around by a lot of people. They don't actually seem that much in charge. There always seem to be other people who are in charge. And there's also part of this book where we get introduced to an organisation where like male and female roles are kind of like swapped around. Like, women are in charge and men are kind of servants, and I don't know, I think just flipping gender roles can be really interesting, but if it's done well, like if you devote some attention to it and kind of point out why neither of these things is good, like why people should be equals and not one above the other. And I just kind of felt like the book didn't really address that. It just showed men in inferior positions, but it didn't really kind of address that that wasn't great either. I don't know, that's kind of why I feel like it's not feminist. Maybe other people feel like, oh, but at least it will make people think about it, but I don't know, I just, for me personally, it just wasn't really enough to call it feminist. What's probably my favourite aspect of this story was the characters. As I mentioned, I didn't really like two of the characters from whose point of view the book was written, but one of the other characters, Iad, I particularly really liked her. I thought she was really relatable. I kind of liked, she was one of those women who is both kind of very strong, but at the same, and like also in the physical sense, like she's a fighter, but at the same time she's also just sensitive, and she likes certain things that are usually liked by females. I don't know, I guess I just feel like she was actually a female character who was both strong and feminine, because that's kind of what I've seen in a lot of YA, that kind of certain women are presented as being really badass fighters and being really feminine, but I also often feel like they're one or the other. They're not really believable as strong characters, or they're not really that feminine, but it's usually that they're just not really believable as fighters. That's what I feel like. But with Iad, I felt like she was really believable as both. Another character who I also really liked was Sabrin, the Queen of Innis, the current Queen of Innis. In the beginning she was not very likable, but I really liked how, you know, other characters kind of learned more about her and learned, you know, saw her differently and saw that she wasn't who she might have initially appeared to be, and I kind of liked coming to that same conclusion as a reader as well. So I kind of liked that sort of, it wasn't really a development, I guess, because I don't think it was necessarily her that was changing so much. I think it was more that just people understood her better, I guess. But I really liked that kind of like that shifting idea of who she was. And then the last thing that I really liked was that there were two queer relationships in this book, and there are like some minor straight relationship, I think, but the main relationships are all queer, and I really like that because I don't think I've really read any high fantasy books actually where there are queer relationships, like in urban fantasy sometimes, but not really in books that are set in different worlds. So I thought that was really fun and just done in a really nice way. Like it received a lot of attention, but it wasn't really done in a way like queer relationships didn't really seem to be an issue in this world, and I kind of liked it. I've seen other people comment that that wouldn't really be realistic because sort of the time period the book is set in, obviously set in a different world, but the time period it's set in kind of would suggest that, and also because religion plays a large role in this book, people think that automatically this world should also have an issue with queer people, which is kind of weird. And I think that's just a very Western idea, because even in the real world it's not as if all religions have an issue with queer people, and it's also not as if queer people didn't really exist until recently. Like there have been other non-Western societies who have for much longer, you know, acknowledged that not everyone is either male or female. So I don't know, I just feel like claiming that every fantasy book that's sort of set in the past should also have an issue with queer people, I feel like that's doesn't really make any sense, and that's just looking through a very Western lens, but that's my personal opinion. And also just it's a fantasy book, like you're already changing so many things, so why couldn't you change the way people see queer people? I don't know, I don't really get that, but I kind of liked how it was done in this book. When it comes to the world, I thought it was quite interesting. Maybe not the most developed fantasy world I've ever read about, but I do think it was much more developed than most YA books, and I liked reading about the world and learning more. But I did feel like the West was much more developed than the East in this book. Like the West there were different countries in the West and they all had a very distinct feel, whereas in the East it felt very much like it was just very clearly inspired by Japan and China, especially Japan. Like one of the countries was very clearly mirrored on Japan, and that just kind of made it less interesting. Like I felt like everything I was learning about this world I kind of already seemed to know about Japan almost. Like obviously in this fantasy setting, so not exactly the same, but I just felt like the Eastern world just wasn't as interesting as a fantasy world because it just had so many kind of almost generic Japanese elements that authors might want to insert into their novel to give it like a Japanese feel, sort of. Especially there was a trading post on an island that was closed off to the mainland, and I can't remember the name what it's called in the book, but it just very clearly seems to be based on Dejima, which used to be a Dutch trading post in Japan when other countries were forbidden to trade with Japan because they were kind of pushing their religion, and the Dutch, even though they were religious, they weren't really pushing their religion as much, like when it comes to Europeans. So yeah, that was just, that island just seemed very clearly based on that trading post, and like during that time when the Dutch were the only ones trading with the Japanese from the West again. So yeah, I don't know, since I already knew about that, it just didn't really feel as interesting, and the world just in the East, I feel like it could have been much more interesting as a fantasy world. So yeah, as you can hear, I kind of have mixed feelings, but overall I did enjoy it. I think it was a solid fantasy, just not one of the best, but also I do think it's quite a lot better than a lot of other YA fantasy that I've been reading, I think. And I did like the characters, and I did like parts of the magic system and the world, but my main issue again was just it's very long and just not all points of view really feel necessary. I'd be really curious to hear if you've read this and what your thoughts on the book were, especially if you might have also not really given it like 4 or 5 stars, because I've seen so many people do that and I feel like my opinion is almost a bit unpopular perhaps. But yeah, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on the book, and maybe I'll see you in the next video. Bye!